Hello and welcome to Wednesday Wellness presented by Trinity Health, IHA Medical Group. I'm seeing a lot of people still rolling in, so I'm going to give them a moment or two to join. As we wait for them, we will just cover a few housekeeping items tonight. So first of all participants are muted with your video turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, our presenter this evening will answer them at the end of the presentation. You can click on the Q&A icon, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can enter your question there. Please don't put your questions in chat because we might miss them. So again, we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation, and you can drop those in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This presentation will be recorded and shared with all in attendance this evening. It'll happen in the coming days via email. We'll also include contact info for tonight's presenter and any other resources discussed tonight. So tonight's presentation is titled Plant-Based Diet for Weight Loss, and our presenting provider is Dr. Korycinski, a board-certified family physician. He graduated from Drexel University and completed his residency in family medicine at University of Michigan. So Dr. Korycinski, are you ready?
I am ready. Can you see me okay?
Yeah, you look great. You sound great. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's joining us via Zoom for this. I really appreciate that you're having an interest in plant-based diet and specifically as it relates to weight loss. So without further ado, let's get started here. So some goals for the presentation. We're going to define categories of weight loss because I think it's important to start from a similar foundation, make sure we're all on the same page. Really talk about why we should care about weight loss at all, identify some popular weight loss trends, and really transition that into defining what a plant-based diet is and why I think it's a superior diet, not just for weight loss, but just generally speaking and as a lifestyle ultimately. And then talk a little bit about how you can start a plant-based diet and then maybe answer some questions toward the end that everyone might have. So starting with some important terms here, you may have been to your doctor's office and heard them throw around terms like BMI and using that to reference your weight in some sort of way. The ultimate really use for that is to denote your weight as it relates to your height. And so you can imagine that somebody who weighs 250 pounds and is 6'5" is going to have different consequences to their health as a result of that weight compared to somebody who's 250 pounds and weighs and is 5'5" or is 6 feet tall or is 4'8". Really, BMI is a way that we can compare your weight to your height in a single number and then kind of compare that to what the potential health consequences of your weight ultimately are. So as a frame of reference, healthy weight is generally considered a BMI of around 18.5 to 25, overweight from 25 to 30, obese from 30 to 35, morbidly obese, we call it when your BMI is from 35 to 40, and anything above 40 is considered severely obese. So again, just as a frame of reference here, average US adult male is about 5'9". To have a BMI in the healthy range would mean that that man would weigh around 150 pounds. An average US woman is about 5'4", 5'3", 5'4", which would be a weight of about 130 pounds at that height to fall into a healthy range. Note that I'm putting the heights for men and women here. Ultimately, the BMI is the same if that woman was 5'9" and weighed 150 pounds, would be the same thing in terms of BMI as a man who's 5'9" and weighs 150 pounds. They just meant to give you the average based on the usual heights for men and women in the US. I've included this in here hopefully as an easy way for you to take a look at what your BMI might be if you're watching. Again, just as an estimate here, I think you might be able to see the mouse here and I'll try to guide us along. But so for instance, I'm 6'4". If you look at my height on the left here, and I'm about 190 to 200 pounds, which would put my BMI in the 23 to 24 range. So if you take your height on the left, your weight on the top, and find where they cross, where they intersect, that would usually, that would give you your BMI roughly. And so anything in this kind of grayish, bluish zone is meant to denote a BMI that is underweight, healthy weight, overweight, obese in this orange zone, morbidly obese in the pink, and then severely obese in the red. But why should we care about all this? I think that's probably the most important question in all of this. I mean, we can tell you what your BMI is. We can put you on a scale and take a look at what your weight is when you come into the office. You can do those things on your own at home even. Why should we actually care about all that? Well, I mentioned earlier there's some health consequences, and nearly 1 in 3 adults in the US is overweight. Nearly, in fact, more than 2 in 5 adults are obese, which means that roughly 3 in every 4 people in adults in the United States are either overweight or obese, which is just shy of 190 million people in this country alone. So it's not a minority problem in any way. In fact, it's quite convincingly the majority. And it has impacts on your health overall. So we know there are a number of conditions that can be associated with a higher BMI, and there's generally a gradient risk here. So the higher your BMI, the more likely you are to have many of these things. Most folks will know about things like diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, even heart attack and stroke. Turns out you're also at risk for greater than 13 different kinds of cancer, arthritis, gout, asthma, death from COVID and flu, dementia, sleep apnea, kidney stones. The list really goes on and on. And so all of these things are associated with a higher BMI. And so if a higher BMI is associated with these potential health consequences, you might surmise that weight loss actually leads to an improvement in some of these things, and it does. And so just as an example, in somebody who's severely obese, so somebody with a BMI greater than 40, which would be that same 5'9" man, for instance, earlier, weighing about 280 to 300 pounds, reduces their risk of diabetes and sleep apnea by 40% by losing 10 to 15% of that weight, or roughly 20 to 30 pounds. High blood pressure and cholesterol risks drop by about 20%. These things are direct risk factors for heart attack and stroke, and sleep apnea is for high blood pressure, which in and of itself is then a risk for heart attack and stroke. So it's really important to pay attention to weight for these reasons, right? We're not just wanting to see the number change on a scale or a BMI start to go down. It's really your health that we care about. Similarly, arthritis of the knees, and this actually applies to the hips as well, weight loss of about 10% in that same person can reduce pain from arthritis of the knees or hips by as much as 50%, in fact, by an average of 50%, sometimes more, somebody who's overweight or obese. Greater pain reductions with even greater pain loss, and it slows the progression of arthritis, which is ultimately a progressive condition. So how do we actually lose weight, right? It's nice to be able to have your doctor say, hey, you know, here's what your BMI is, here's what the consequences are. I want you to lose some weight. Well, how do you actually go about doing that? We're going to talk about a few really common ways that people tend to do that, and some popular diet trends, things like intermittent fasting, Weight Watchers, keto diet, paleo diet, Mediterranean diet, which is actually pretty close to a plant-based diet. But there are many others like DASH and Whole30 and Atkins, cleanse diets, juicing diets, various other things that we just don't quite have the time to get into and are not really the focus of the presentation. So intermittent fasting, a lot of folks have heard of this. In case you haven't, it's a diet that basically alternates periods of low food consumption or fasting with periods of higher normal food consumption. Most popular trend is the 16-8, where you fast or consume next to nothing for 16 hours of the day, and for the other 8 hours, you're either consuming normally or actually in excess of what you normally would eat. There's the 20 and 4, which essentially breaks it down into 20 hours and 4 hours instead. There's the 5 and 2, where you eat regularly for 5 days and then calorie restrict on weekend days. Sometimes you can alternate days in that way. The attempt with a diet like this is that during periods of fasting, when your body doesn't have energy to use as a fuel source, your body starts breaking down fat for that fuel source instead. And so you start to lose weight as a result of that. So big downsides, though, is if you're not eating, you're going to feel not so great. Decreased energy, irritable mood, low blood sugar, which can be particularly dangerous if you have diabetes, especially if you're on medicines, even more so if you're on insulin in particular for diabetes, things that are meant to lower your blood sugar already. They can actually be life-threatening. Likely to overeat, studies have shown on the non-fasting days or hours. If you eat 5,000 calories during the 4 hours you're allowing yourself to eat during a day, you're still consuming 4 to 5,000 calories. So it still makes a difference. And anybody who's tried to take medicines on an empty stomach knows the kind of havoc that can wreak. Weight Watchers advertises a personal diet plan. It's based on a point system where you're allotted a certain number of points per day that you can spend on foods. Each food costs a certain number of points, and generally the more unhealthy or calorie dense something is, the more it's going to cost. There are certain 0-point foods, they call it, that don't cost any points to consume, things like fruits, vegetables, includes things like eggs and yogurt commonly, though it's slightly different for everyone. It does come with an app, and so you can track points, you can talk to health coaches, you can be a part of a community, and so there are definitely some benefits to it. Biggest downside probably is that it comes at the cost of a subscription, which is a standard monthly fee of about $23 a month. This was actually studied back in 2019 that women who lost about 5% of their body weight using Weight Watchers actually spent closer to $70 a month to achieve that weight loss, just based on the extra features and things you could purchase above the base fee for Weight Watchers. Requires weekly weigh-ins to track progress. It's really easy to store up points and almost do a kind of intermittent fasting diet where you eat close to nothing during the day, and then later in the day use all your stored up points to eat really unhealthy or calorie dense foods. And counting points in and of itself can be pretty stressful. Keto diet, definitely been a very popular diet trend over the past probably 4 or 5 years now. If you take nothing else away from this slide, just know that the focus of the diet is to consume less than 5% of your calories from carbohydrate. And much like with intermittent fasting, when you don't have carbohydrate to use as a fuel source, your body starts breaking down fat. Fat produces these things called ketones, and that's actually where the keto diet name comes from. Your body goes into what's called a state of ketosis from breaking down fat. Biggest downsides is that while you can lose weight on a diet like this, it limits the intake of whole grains, beans, fruits, many vegetables, and can lead to things like nutrient deficiencies. It's restrictive and can be very hard to follow. Keto flu is something that people can experience. Ketones are not good for you ultimately in high quantities, and can actually have a similar impact on your brain that alcohol can over time. Can lead to short-term fatigue, headache, brain fog, upset stomach, and in the long term can increase your risk for things like kidney stones, osteoporosis or thinning bones, and liver disease. Paleo diet is something that's fallen out of favor a little bit more recently. I haven't heard quite as much about a paleo diet from many of my patients as I used to, but just to go through this real quick as well, the idea is that you're only eating foods that were essentially available to us in the Stone Age, or what we call the Paleolithic period. That's where the name paleo comes from. So things like seeds, nuts, fruit, vegetables, wild game, eggs. Basically, if it was produced in a factory or cultivated on a farm, things like beans, grains, you should shy away from it. There's some pros to the paleo diet, and that it's high in potassium. If that's not, if you don't have a history of kidney disease and that's not something you're worried about, can be a good thing. Protein content tends to be high. It eliminates processed foods, which I'm very much in favor of, but it's not actually designed for weight loss in any way, despite how it's sometimes commonly depicted. It limits the consumption of healthy foods that can be good for gut health and can lead to nutrient deficiencies. And it encourages the overconsumption of unhealthy fats and cholesterol, which we'll get into a little bit more later as well. And then lastly, the Mediterranean diet, probably the closest thing to a plant-based diet. Emphasis on healthy fats like olive oil, high fruit and vegetable consumption of beans, does usually incorporate some amount of seafood and red wine, though, as part of it. Though there isn't one specific Mediterranean diet, it generally incorporates a variety of nutrient-dense foods. There's evidence of reduced risk for heart disease, cancer, and inflammation associated with it. Foods tend to be pretty satiating and prevent overconsumption. It does take a lot more prep time a lot of the time for meals that are commonly associated with the Mediterranean diet. Typical ingredients tend to be pretty expensive. There's really no adherence to a specific regimen, and there are concerns about alcohol consumption associated with it. It's become sort of popularized over time as this diet that allows me to consume as much red wine as I'd like. And ultimately, it's not good to have a half a bottle to a bottle of red wine a day, thinking that it's healthy for you. So I have definitely heard that as a reason for starting a Mediterranean diet from some of my patients. I definitely would not endorse that. But what about a plant-based diet? Hopefully that's what most, if not all of you, are here to talk about. And so let's dive into that a little bit. What does that actually mean when I say plant-based? Well, so plant-based is really just any sort of diet that emphasizes plant-based foods for health and well-being specifically. And so that could be potentially a vegetarian diet, which incorporates just about everything other than meat and fish, a pescatarian diet, which is a vegetarian that allows for fish consumption as well, or a flexitarian that I kind of joke is like a vegetarian who's weak of will from time to time. somebody who generally will eat a vegetarian diet 90 to 95% of the time, which is ultimately, for the most part, a healthy thing to do. But then we'll kind of, on rare occasion, allow for consumption of things like meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. A vegan or a vegan diet, something that includes everything other than meat, dairy, eggs, and usually honey as well. Often, but not always, associated with sort of ethical and environmental concerns about factory farming and meat consumption and a number of other things politically that tend to be associated with the diet. And then, as I mentioned, plant-based is really more an emphasis on health and well-being as it relates to plant food consumption. A whole foods plant-based diet, just to throw this out there as well, is very much focused on health and well-being through the consumption of plant-based foods, but also emphasizes eating foods in their unprocessed forms. So if you have the choice between eating, corn on the cob and a corn chip of some kind, that corn chip is going to be processed, and so it's a rough kind of easy comparison to get the point across. And so I took this from a website called Forks Over Knives. Some of you may recognize it's also a documentary on Netflix. It's also a really good book. Would highly recommend looking into it if you have the time. In fact, I'm going to mention it again toward the end of the presentation here. But these are the kinds of things that are typically incorporated into a plant-based diet. So fruits, vegetables, tubers, things like sweet potatoes, carrots, beets, whole grains like quinoa and whole wheat, pastas and breads and rice, oats, and legumes, which you can think about as being beans, essentially. So kidney beans, chickpeas, lentils, things like that. Plenty of benefits to a plant-based diet. And again, we'll circle around to weight loss specifically here in just a moment. But I want to try and highlight why I think a plant-based diet is the best diet to use to lose weight. And in part, it's not just because it's effective at helping you to do that, but because it actually helps you to be healthier overall, even independent of the weight loss, though also in part because of the weight loss. So for heart health, you reduce your risk of heart attack by roughly 30% on average by switching from an American diet to a plant-based diet, around 25% lower risk of death from heart disease when switching to a diet like that, is the only intervention that we know of that reverses plaque buildup, which is the stuff that builds up in the arteries around your heart and causes a heart attack. And I really want to highlight that for a moment here. It is the only thing that we know that reverses plaque buildup around the heart. And similarly with diabetes, the only intervention that we know of that can cure diabetes, not just improve it, not just potentially reduce your blood sugars by 35% if you already have it, not just really significantly reduce your risk of having diabetes or developing it if you don't already have it, but actually reverse diabetes entirely. So if you're on 3 different medicines for diabetes, feel free to try this and then enjoy when you get to throw some of those medicines in the trash because you don't need them anymore. Additional benefits, reductions in blood pressure. So that top number in the 2 numbers you get for your blood pressure, generally a reduction of around 5 to 15 points, reduction in cholesterol. And then I kind of wish we were doing this in person because I'd be curious to see a show of hands who knew that the World Health Organization actually classifies meat, and especially red meat, as a carcinogen or a cancer-causing substance in the same category as smoking and asbestos. Few things, if any, that we know are more strongly associated with colon cancer than meat, especially red meat consumption. And so again, kind of circling around to weight loss here. So switching from a typical American diet to a plant-based diet, folks usually see a reduction in their BMI around 4 to 5 points in a 3 to 6 month interval, which equates to about 25 pounds in that same time interval. Variations depending on how quickly you transition to a diet like that from an American diet. These are all just kind of generalities, but this should be the general takeaway as far as weight loss goes. And if you're interested in learning more about the benefits of a plant-based diet specifically, you can learn more about the weight loss that's associated with it outside of what we're going to progress into next. Would highly recommend these books. There's a number of specials on places like Netflix that you can watch. The 2 books on the left, How Not to Die and How Not to Diet, particularly good books if you're looking for a place to really dive deeper into any of this. So I just thought I'd throw those out there. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I've sold you on the benefits of a plant-based diet, and you've seen that you can lose weight on a plant-based diet, and you really want to know, how do I actually begin? What does that process actually look like? Well, I really think that making small changes makes a big difference over time. If you're somebody who can be gung-ho and go from eating Little Caesars and Taco Bell every day, or whatever your diet was, I use that as an example because that's how I ate actually before I started a plant-based diet. if you can make a big change like that overnight, then power to you, but it can be difficult. It takes some time to adjust to changes that drastic, especially if you're doing it for 3 meals a day. So consider substituting one plant-based food item into your daily routine in place of something like meat, dairy, seafood, or eggs, or even consider one item or one meal at a time, maybe even one day a week. Every step along the way, you're still becoming healthier. You're starting that journey to lose weight on a healthier diet. It will happen over time. And so just as an example, let's just say you like to consume eggs. You like eggs. I used to like eggs a lot. I'll raise my hand for liking eggs. I don't consume them anymore, and I really don't miss them very much, but there are ways to substitute other things for it so that you kind of develop a taste for different things over time. And so just as an example, let's say, in 1 week, or let's just call it week 1, you decide that on Monday morning, instead of your usual eggs, you're going to have some whole wheat toast with some peanut butter on it. Maybe even jazz it up a bit, throw on some banana and maybe a little bit of cinnamon. And you're going to do that just on Monday this 1 week. Next week, in week 2, on Monday, you're going to have that whole wheat toast with some peanut butter on it. And then maybe you're going to have like a whole grain cereal, like the one shown in the bottom left here, with some almond milk. Maybe add a little bit of fruit to jazz that up too. And then maybe the next week you do it for 3 meals. And then the next week you do it for 4 meals or 4 days. And then eventually, bit by bit, you're transitioning your tastes. You're discovering things that you like. You're discovering some things that you don't like, because you're not going to like everything. Just like you probably don't like everything now. But you're getting to be healthier. That weight loss is going to start to come along with it. And so this is just meant to be a very kind of general example of how that step-by-step might look. Similarly, and we won't dwell on it too much, because I think I got the point across in that last slide, hopefully, but let's say you eat a turkey sandwich every day. Maybe try something like a wrap with some vegetables and avocado, make yourself a salad. If you're really getting adventurous with it and you're enjoying what you're doing, making something like a flatbread with the same ingredients. And I think actually it's worth noting, I'm realizing this now as I'm talking to you all, that note that these pictures are taken from online. I did not make these foods. Nothing that I make looks this good. It tastes probably as good as this looks, but nothing that I make looks this good. And it takes a lot of effort to do some of this stuff. It doesn't have to, ultimately. The wrap on the top right there can be as easy as making that turkey sandwich. You just have to know what to get and really explore and try to start that process slowly but surely, and it will come along. Same kind of deal. Say you consume something like chicken breast for dinner, try to take some of those same ingredients from the salad you made earlier in the day or the day before and maybe make a taco out of it that's plant-based. Try something like a black bean burger, maybe use some tofu to make a vegetable bowl. Really, the sky's the limit on what you can try here. And again, I do want to highlight, it's going to take some time if you're not used to eating this way to realizing what you can purchase and what you can put into your foods, what combinations you like. It is going to take some time, but I promise you're going to be grateful that you gave it the effort. And to that end, it's never really been a better time to find plant-based foods in the store. You don't have to go to Whole Foods and spend $30 on a box of whole grain crackers. You can go to Aldi, you can go to Trader Joe's, you can go to Kroger, you can go to Meijer, you can go to Bush's, you can go to any number of grocery stores that might be near you and find something like this down an aisle. And I kind of highlighted some of this a little bit already, but generally speaking, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks for taste buds to adjust to new foods that you eat. Again, kind of throwing myself out there for everyone to examine. I was eating a Little Caesars and Taco Bell diet essentially before I transitioned to a plant-based one. Wasn't feeling good on it, and that's why I made the transition ultimately. The first time I tried a piece of broccoli, I vomited. I thought it was awful. Why would anybody do this? This is really dumb. Why is anybody making this effort? And then I'm also stubborn, so I gave it a chance. And hand to God, roasted broccoli is one of my favorite things on the planet now. Add a little onion powder, some garlic powder, a little bit of black pepper, and some salt. You'll thank me for it. It's very easy to make, and you can actually have enough that you can make in probably 30 to 60 minutes to last you an entire week if that's really your deal. But know that a veggie burger is not going to taste like a hamburger. Tofu is not going to taste like chicken, because they're not those things. Vegan cheese is not cheese. Anybody who tells you that vegan cheese tastes just as good as real cheese has either never had real cheese or is lying. I'm just going to throw that out there. It can be very good in its own right, but the expectation has to be set there, because I think a lot of folks expect these things to taste exactly the same, and they don't. They taste good in their own way, and it does take some time to adjust to that. But be adventurous. I mentioned this already. The sky's the limit with what you can try, the combinations of food and food items you can mix in. I eat a number of things now that I never imagined that I would before, and I enjoy quite a lot of them. So it'll take some time for you to learn what you like too. I give this handout to a lot of folks. This isn't a handout that I made, but is actually cultivated by our IHA group within Trinity Health. It's an example of what a plant-based diet can look as a 5-day meal plan. I'm not going to linger on this too much for the sake of time. I think I gave some examples already of some things that you might find on here. The point is, you really can build a diet in this way that is not only sustainable, but is delicious and healthy and gives you the energy you need throughout the day. Just a real quick glance at this as well. I like to give this handout to folks. It just gives you an idea of what a serving of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, proteins, dairy alternatives, healthy fats, and things look like when you really set up the food groups to be more plant-based oriented. Mentioned earlier that I took a picture from a place called Forks Over Knives, which is a website, a documentary, a really good book. Their website has quite literally hundreds of recipes that you can look into if you're looking for a place to start. They have a beginner's guide that actually introduces you to the ideas of plant-based eating and some recipes that you might like. They do have a meal planner. Notice that or know that if you go that route, they, I believe, do require a subscription for someone to actually plan your meals for you. But they have all the same recipes that they would otherwise recommend on their website if you just take some time to explore and find what you think you might like and be interested in making. And they range from very simple things to more complex if you're already down this path and want to be a bit more adventurous. But again, what about weight loss? I'm talking about the health benefits of a plant-based diet and how to transition to it. Where does the weight loss actually come into all this? Well, changing your diet is the plan. It actually is that simple. You're going to start losing weight as you continue to transition your diet more to being one that's plant-based. Know that you're becoming healthier from day one. Even if your weight doesn't change by day 2, you are becoming healthier as a result of transitioning to this diet. And the weight will come too. As I highlighted earlier, that 25-pound weight loss in that 3 to 6 month time interval, it's a reasonable expectation. I usually tell folks, regardless of the type of lifestyle or diet that you're attempting, if it's intermittent fasting, if it's keto, if it's transitioning to a plant-based diet, like I hope you'll consider, a reasonable expectation is about a pound per week of weight loss. I don't know if the TV show is still on. If you've ever seen The Biggest Loser and you've watched people drop 30 pounds in a week, that is not real life. That is also not a healthy way to lose weight. It's just not. A pound a week is a reasonable expectation. Some of that will change if you're exercising vigorously. If you consume 5,000 calories worth of plant-based food, you're still going to have a slower process of losing weight, but will ultimately be healthier for it anyway. And if you have pre-existing health conditions, that can definitely influence it too. But know that about a pound a week on average is what you should expect. And it's what I would expect for you to happen if you were transitioning from something like a typical American diet to a plant-based one. Let's say, again, for the sake of argument, you've been sticking with me this long, you're still interested in a plant-based diet. Everything I've said to you sounds good. At the very least, the rest of my presentation depends on it. So I'm going to assume that anyway. What could go wrong, right? All this sounds really good. What could actually go wrong here? Well, notice that this is actually a plant-based diet as well. In case you didn't know, vegan Oreos are actually entirely vegan. There's nothing dairy or animal-based about them at all. I know a few folks who eat this kind of a diet. They don't feel good, and wouldn't you know it, they really don't lose a whole lot of weight either. They actually do a little bit, but not very much. So this can be a plant-based diet too. This can also be a plant-based diet. These options are healthier than their meat-based alternatives overall, but they're also pretty calorie dense, much like their meat counterparts are. And so it's going to make losing weight a lot harder as well. And they're really just not the healthiest things to be eating either way. They're still packed with fats, albeit generally slightly healthier fats. But this can be a plant-based diet too. This can also be a plant-based diet. I think stereotypically, this is a lot of times what people think when they think about a plant-based diet. You're going to lose weight on a diet like this. If you're just eating one meal a day of a plate full of lettuce, you're going to lose weight. You're probably not going to feel very good doing it that way. You're also probably going to lose interest pretty quick and realize that this is just not in any way a sustainable or enjoyable way to eat. So know that there are pitfalls here, but there are ways to avoid some of those things. And so I always tell folks, everything in moderation, including moderation. Meat replacement products, plant-based desserts, they shouldn't be the backbone of a weight loss plan, and they shouldn't be the backbone of a plant-based diet either. But it is okay to enjoy them on occasion. Variety is ultimately your best friend. Any diet is really, really boring if you're eating the same thing every day. If that's your deal, if that's something you like because it's easier for you, I'm not telling you not to do it. It's just not generally sustainable for the vast majority of people. And don't be afraid to try something new. As I said earlier, you're gonna learn the things that you like if you transition to a plant-based diet, but it is gonna take some effort to find and try new things that you otherwise thought you might not like, much like I did, and I'm grateful for that and having done that process. Consider enlisting some family or friends to try a plant-based diet. You can consider joining plenty of online or in-person groups that exist across the world, let alone across the country. Change can be pretty hard, but there's no need to do it alone. Ask your doctor for help, for instance. Not everyone is going to understand what you're doing. Just feel comfortable and confident knowing that you're doing what you need to do to lose weight and that you're doing it in a healthy way. Know that you're not alone in doing it, but the simple truth is not everyone is fully going to understand why you're making these changes. I really think that they're important anyway. And if you want to lose weight, it's a really, really, really good, healthy way to do it. Plan ahead. I often find that regardless of the type of diet or lifestyle change you're trying to make, there are things that can derail it. Things like family get-togethers, holidays, other special occasions. Consider prepping your own food ahead of time, bringing it with you. Something similar but plant-based to what everybody else might be eating, just so you're not tempted. If you're somebody who can go to a family gathering and binge or do whatever you're going to do there, I don't judge, and then can immediately go back to what you did before on a plant-based diet, then again, more power to you. You have more willpower than I do. But it's also generally just not sustainable, and it's something that tends to derail even the best of intentions. So hopefully everyone here got something, at least so far, out of what I've said. I'm happy to answer any questions. I actually went through that just a little bit faster than I intended, but I wanted to leave you with a picture of my family. So I mentioned I eat a plant-based diet. I have for the better part of a decade now. My wife has been vegan since she was 16, I believe, 15, 16. And I have a 5-year-old and 1-year-old daughter who are both plant-based as well and have been for their entire lives. So yeah, again, went through that a little faster than intended, but hopefully everybody got a little bit of something out of that. And I'm happy to answer as many questions as we can get to in the time allotted. So I will leave you with that.
Okay, awesome. Adorable babies there. And I know there are some questions actually about children and how you can kind of get them going on a plant-based diet. So it sounds like one of the people who's in attendance is a vegetarian. She's trying to transition her children off of dairy. And I know that cow milk is very hard to replicate. And so what do you recommend for trying to transition kids off of dairy? And I'm going to add into that, do you have a favorite milk substitute that you could share?
Yeah, so I for kids especially, I actually like, this is kind of a newer thing and may sound a little bit odd, but actually pea protein milk. I would argue it actually tastes pretty similar to cow's milk, though that's not ultimately the intention of making that transition. Can sometimes make it a little bit easier. In terms of nutrition, can actually be fairly similar, though I'll try my best not to go off on a tangent here. Even with cow's milk, in terms of nutrition, the vitamin D that's in cow's milk is actually added and is not, you can't milk a cow and get vitamin D that way. Those sorts of things are also added to various different types of milks. And so for people who are worried about calcium and vitamin D and all that kind of stuff for kids, it's really not as much of a concern as it should be as a result of all that. But I like pea protein milk. My kids drink it. I like almond milk in particular. Anybody who shops at Trader Joe's, they have I don't want to say sugar-free, but a low sugar almond milk that I've loved for a long time now. So hope that answers the question, but yeah, I'd give something like that a try.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so it sounds like we have a couple people who are already on plant-based diets and they run into some hiccups. So we want to see if you can kind of help guide them through that. So I'm going to start with the first one. They're looking to populate their gut microbiome with some good bacteria. So they said they know red cabbage is supposed to be good. Do you have any other examples?
In terms of gut microbiome, ultimately, if you're eating a variety of foods, something like that is going to happen on its own. There are some ideas that red cabbage, and even some like drinks like kombucha and things like that can be really good for gut microbiome. I'll be honest, I tend not to focus on that quite as much, because if the diet is varied and plant-based, it's ultimately going to happen on its own. There really doesn't need to be a separate effort. If you have specific conditions, there's a school of thought that with IBS, consuming some of those kinds of things sometimes can be detrimental if they're particularly high in fiber, but the gut microbiome kind of diversity you get from it can be altered in that way. Yeah, I'll be honest, I tend not to focus on that much, purely because if you're eating the right variety of foods, it's going to happen on its own.
So that sounds like the nice thing about a plant-based diet is you don't have to feel guilty at any point. You can just eat as much as you want.
Yeah, well, so
Right
I mentioned earlier that Oreo diet is a real thing. It is technically
Yeah.
plant-based under that category, so maybe not
So like
everything.
whole food. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you hit it on the head otherwise, though. Yeah.
Okay. So we have someone else who's also on a plant-based, well, it's a full plate diet, she calls it. So, but they're worried about pesticides because they can't always purchase organic fruits and vegetables. So what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so there are certain foods I usually don't worry about pesticides quite as much. I'm trying to think of one offhand here. So things like avocados, for instance, because they have a harder outer shell. Any food really, or I guess you should say any fruit or vegetable that has kind of a harder outer shell is really not going to be quite as concerning, because it doesn't penetrate into the food the same way that it does if it was something like a carrot that grows in the ground, for instance. So I guess that's one thing to consider. If you're eating an apple, for instance, that's not organic, if you wash it thoroughly, it's generally going to counteract any issues with the pesticides just in general. I would encourage doing that with apples just in general, because even the organic come with labels on them that tend to have all sorts of adhesives and things that I like to wash off anyway. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay. How about, so we have someone who lowered their cholesterol 32 points and lost 35 pounds, but they started to have some muscle weakness. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard to say any one specific thing about that, because there's about 10 different things that come to mind immediately that could be the cause of your muscle weakness that have nothing to do with a plant-based diet. If you're particularly concerned about that, I would encourage you not just to transition to a plant-based diet, but also to consider the weight-bearing physical activity that goes along with it. That can happen even on, if all you're consuming is meat, but you're sedentary and you're not really moving around, you're not exercising in any way, the same sort of thing can happen. So I'd actually encourage you to follow up with your doctor, whether that's, I don't know who this person is, whether that's me or that's another doctor of any kind, just to talk about why that might be, even independent of the plant-based food.
Okay, awesome. And you are accepting new patients, correct?
I am, yeah.
Awesome.
If anybody, this is hopefully just giving you a little bit of a taste of more that I might have to offer if you're willing to come see me. So.
Yeah, amazing. And we will share your contact information in the follow-up email in the next few days.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay. I have noticed this as well. When you go to the grocery store, there's so many things that are labeled plant-based, and I know that things are labeled fat-free, and then there are all kinds of other issues that kind of come along with that.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of artificial additives, and so just because it's labeled plant-based, it's not always good for you, right?
Yeah, that actually is a really good point. And again, I think I tried to highlight that a little bit with, it's become really popular to advertise, especially these meat replacement products. And they, I'll just use that as one example of potentially many. They have their purpose in moderation, and they can sometimes help you transition to a plant-based diet or consume something that isn't as unhealthy as meat, where you otherwise might have. But an Impossible or Beyond Meat burger, it's really not healthy for you. It's just not. It's healthier than the alternative, but you don't want to build a diet around something like that. And so you're right. There does come with trying to find healthy foods, and again, this goes for foods even that aren't plant-based. Sometimes things that are advertised as healthy or low fat, or they may be low fat, but they're all saturated fats, or they're all trans fats. There's a little bit more nuance than what we covered here. And again, I'd encourage you to talk with your doctor about that, or even a dietitian. We have a dietitian in our office in East Brighton who helps folks with this sort of thing. So yeah, to just encourage you to reach out for a more kind of personalized plan or education about what you're looking for.
Okay, awesome. So there are a lot of questions around condiments. So
Mhm.
salad dressings, peanut butter on toast,
Mhm.
olive oil. What are your thoughts? Can you really get a healthy condiment to put on your burger or to put on your salad, or is it better to just sort of eat it natural?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're somebody like my wife, for instance, who can eat a salad with pretty much nothing else on it because she just loves the taste of the vegetables and everything so much, I can do that on occasion too. I would just say in moderation, like I said earlier. Olive oil and other types of dressings can be a source of healthy fats, and in fact, healthy fats can actually help with the digestion and absorption of certain vitamins. They're actually called fat soluble vitamins. You actually need a little bit of fat in your diet from something to help you absorb some of those things. But you don't need to go to town on it. You can still enjoy some of the things you normally would, just maybe being mindful about how much you're adding. I tend to tell folks not to focus too much on ingredient labels, though it can be helpful, as we just talked about with the other question. Just know what you're actually putting on your food. If a tablespoon of a dressing has so much fat in it, don't dump half the bottle on it, right? So it just takes a little bit more effort to pay attention to something like that. We could go on about other condiments, but I think the same thing still applies, that generally in moderation, you're not going to steer yourself too wrong.
Awesome. So I would venture to guess that anyone who moves to a whole foods plant-based diet probably gets the question at some point, where are you getting your protein from? Can you talk about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, well, so this hits close to home. I mentioned earlier when we were looking at BMIs that I'm a 6'4" male who's about 200 pounds, who grew up with several college football players who I still consider close friends, and so I am constantly asked this. It's kind of a misnomer, to say protein when you're referencing meat. I guess I'm realizing now that I actually didn't include this a whole lot of this in this presentation, but things like lentils and quinoa and beans of various types, chickpeas in particular. All of those kinds of things will add protein to any meal that you add them to. I've had athletes that I've worked with, just folks who are trying to put on muscle even, who can easily get between 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is a lot of sources would recommend something like that for building muscle. Would argue that the number should be lower than that, but it is achievable, much like you would trying to consume meat on a non-plant-based diet. Just as a quick plug, not sure if he is anymore, but within the last 5 years or so, I'm pretty sure the strongest man in the world, those strongman competitions, actually was the strongest man in the world on a plant-based diet. You can get plenty of protein from a plant-based diet. You just got to explore a little bit how to do that.
And kind of along the same lines, what about soy protein? Is
Yes, I
that
mean,
healthy
oh,
for
sorry.
you? Go ahead.
Yeah. So soy is actually a good source of plant-based protein. So it's the primary protein you're getting when you're consuming tofu or something like edamame, if anybody's familiar with that. I'm not sure if this is what this question is getting at or not, but I've heard men express concerns about the estrogen-like effects of soy consumption, and other women who have asked about risks of things like breast cancer and uterine cancer associated with the estrogen effects of soy protein consumption. And hopefully I'm not getting too much into the weeds here, but the amount of soy protein you'd have to consume on a daily basis for decades at a time to really significantly increase your risk of the ill effects of that estrogen effect, it's really just not even possible, even if you tried. So I think it's a healthy source of protein, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And how about calcium?
Yeah, so there's a number of different calcium sources. I mentioned earlier that even non-dairy milks will generally have some amount of calcium in them. You can get calcium from green leafy vegetables as well. So if you're eating a variety of foods, it's just something that'll come with part of the diet. You really wouldn't even have to worry about it at that point. Again, barring any sort of deficiencies related to other health conditions. We're talking very generally here. So
Sure, you sort of like led right into the next question. So if you're pre-diabetic, is
yeah.
consuming fruit on a regular basis something that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually. So would encourage anybody who hasn't heard of it before to look up something called the glycemic index. Excuse me, that can give you a little bit better idea of how I'm going to answer this question, or just some additional information if you want it. So the fiber content of foods can impact how it's digested and how the sugar is absorbed into your blood and how much it may or may not raise your blood sugar. So high fiber foods like apples, for instance, while they have a lot of sugar in them, are not going to contribute to rising blood sugar in the way that, say, consuming a chocolate bar would with the same amount of sugar in it. So I guess my long-winded way of saying, if you're an existing diabetic whose blood sugar is out of control, it might be reasonable to look into those things as things you should consume only in moderation. Short of that, though, and especially if it's helping you transition to something that's going to lead to weight loss and reducing your risk of developing diabetes to begin with, I still wouldn't necessarily have you eat fruit for every meal of every, don't just consume fruit. Variety is still the key here, but I really wouldn't worry about it all that much. You're going to get healthier for it, and your risk of diabetes is going to go down if your weight is ultimately part of the reasons you're consuming the fruit to begin with. So.
Awesome. And if someone has chronic kidney disease, would you recommend this diet?
Yeah, so actually, I included it on the slide I had toward the beginning that risks for something like kidney disease are actually a developing kidney disease, I should say, or worsening kidney disease can be associated with a higher BMI. And so anything that helps with weight loss is generally a good idea there. I will say there's some nuances to to somebody with kidney disease and avoiding certain food intake. I would actually encourage you to meet with a dietitian if you're interested in sorting out the nuances there. Calcium consumption, vitamin D, things like that can be either more or less important depending on the degree which you may have a deficit or an issue with some of those things. So nephrologists, kidney specialists are usually good at teasing some of that out as well. But overall, it's absolutely healthy on a plant-based diet as it relates to kidney disease. There's a little more nuance to it there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of questions about transitioning over to a plant-based diet. So the people are asking about the vegan cheeses, and then we talked a little bit about the substitute meats, talking about adding some seasoning to vegetables just to kind of get you through that period.
Yeah.
I assume that, like you said, all of that is sort of okay as you kind of move through. How long should you give yourself in the transition period?
Yeah, so I think I may have alluded to this earlier a little bit too, that it's a good idea it can be a good idea to transition to a plant-based diet through some of those foods, especially if you're excuse me, trying to feed a spouse or a child who's otherwise very picky about making the transition. Some of those can be good kind of intermediary foods, so they shouldn't be the goal long term. Yeah, I mean, I think they're okay in moderation. In terms of making other food choices, it ultimately boils down to just being a bit more adventurous. Excuse me. It can take 3 to 6 weeks, as I said, on average, for taste buds to adjust. I don't vomit when I eat broccoli anymore. In fact, I have quite the opposite response. But it does take some effort and some stubbornness to get used to those things. And the truth is, you're not going to like every new food that you try, but really to give it some effort and know that it takes some time to adjust to it, and that it not only gets easier, but it gets enjoyable after a
time. Good. So if you're someone who doesn't eat any fruits or vegetables, adjusting to that new diet might be a little bit difficult in terms of like your digestive system. So you might feel some stomach aches and things like that. Do you have thoughts on how to kind of make it through that period?
Yeah, I guess I don't know that I necessarily agree with that statement. I think that can happen with just about any diet. It is true that a plant-based diet is generally going to have more fiber, and so if all you're consuming is a salad for every meal of every day, yeah, your digestion is going to run pretty quickly, and you're going to notice some changes there that are maybe not the most comfortable. But again, everything kind of in moderation and exploring various foods. Kind of like we were just alluding to, though, if you're not used to eating that kind of food, really just pick a single food item or a single meal a day. See how that goes, and kind of take it from there.
Okay. So if you're someone who's maybe a little bit underweight, how do you kind of counteract some of the weight loss that might come with switching to a plant-based diet?
Yeah, so That's a really interesting question. I think some of that is going to boil down to calorie count to some degree. You're more likely to lose weight on a plant-based diet just naturally, in part because of the fiber content there. But yeah, I think calorie count makes a big difference there too. There are more calorie dense foods that you can consume on a plant-based diet. Again, would probably be a good idea to meet with a nutrition or your doctor before making that transition. Sometimes in those circumstances, it can also be helpful to have somebody who, as tedious as this sounds, it can sometimes be helpful to have somebody who is kind of peeking over your shoulder every so often, just so you're not, your weight isn't trending down in a bad way. It's not lost on me as well in part of this, that if you're somebody who has, a history of an eating disorder, for instance, not that, the person who asked this does, or that somebody who's of a normal weight and worried about losing weight does, but these are all things that should also be taken into account. And so again, I'd encourage you to talk to your doctor, to a nutritionist, very likely even both, just to make sure you're getting the right calorie content and that your weight doesn't take a dip purely as a result of switching to the diet.
Okay, great. So there are a lot of questions about gluten. So we have someone who is a little bit concerned about gluten and taking in some of those grains. So a plant-based diet doesn't necessarily mean gluten-free, but I assume that you could do a gluten-free option if you have celiac or something along those lines.
Yeah, you absolutely could. And not to keep using her as an example, my wife has sensitivities with gluten, and so she manages to do it. You just got to pay attention to what the diet is built out of.
Okay, great. So it looks like there's somebody who's on a strict renal diet and nuts and beans are not great protein sources for them. Do you have a substitute that you could recommend?
Say that again. Sorry, cut out for a minute for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it sounds like someone is on a renal diet, so they are not able to consume nuts and beans. Do you have a good substitute you could recommend?
Yeah, so it depends on the specific types of nuts and beans, and some nutritionists will tell you to avoid those things on a renal diet. You'll have to forgive me, I can't recall offhand if things like lentils or quinoa otherwise are also excluded on a renal diet. But they can be good protein sources and can be pretty filling and calorie dense as well. If you're consuming enough in terms of fruits and vegetables as well, you can get plenty from that as well. That doesn't fall under the exclusions for a renal diet. So again, it's very individual. And part of that, I think, should be meeting with a nutritionist or your doctor to kind of sort out what your diet looks like and what can and cannot be included, and take things from there.
Excellent. So we have a follow-up question to the protein question. So what is the right amount of protein to eat each day? Or each meal, I guess.
Yeah, so a little bit of this depends on your health history. A little bit depends on who you ask, admittedly, what doctor you talk to or what specialist you talk to. The classic kind of, I'm a bodybuilder, I need to consume protein, is anywhere from like 1 gram to 2 grams, I believe, per kilogram of body weight. There's plenty of evidence to suggest you can build muscle and be healthy on way less than that. And so, I would generally recommend around like 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Again, there isn't really a hard and fast rule about that. It just depends on what your goals are and your health history. I feel like I keep saying this a lot, but I would encourage you to talk to your doctor, your nutritionist, or really hone in on what your physical activity level is and how that can influence it. But the truth is, there really isn't a answer to this question. It's just very person specific, and it depends a little bit on who you ask and what their goals are, and what they want you to do ultimately. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that just around 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight is plenty.
Okay, awesome. So there are a lot of different questions about different vitamins and supplements and things like that. Is there like a certain vitamin or supplement you should take if you're transitioning? And I guess there's so many out there. That's kind of a big question.
Yeah, really the only thing I would be concerned about is B12. So the most common source of B12 in typical American diet is meat. If you've ever tried nutritional yeast or you know anything about it, it's actually often included in like cheese alternatives. actually is a source of B12 as well that is entirely plant-based. It's actually my kids' favorite thing, coincidentally. And so I don't worry about B12 in them at all. But that's probably the one vitamin I would say if you take a supplement for B12, if you're not consuming something like nutritional yeast, would probably be a good idea.
Okay. And there are a lot of people that are asking about chocolate and late night snacking. Like, what are some of your guilty pleasures as a plant-based eater?
Well, I may have put one of them on here already in the Oreos. That definitely is a guilty pleasure for me on occasion. That didn't just come out of left field. You know, this is almost a different topic entirely, and I almost wish I could just bring some people to my house and show them. But you know, my wife and I, my mother-in-law in particular, they make a lot of like plant-based desserts. So there are ways actually to make things like cakes and cookies and other things that are entirely without egg or dairy. I would argue a lot of them actually taste better than the dairy alternative. You may not believe me until you try it yourself, but the Oreos can be a guilty pleasure for sure.
And I think fruit could be too in some cases, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, or even just incorporating fruit into a dessert. If your intention is, you know, I've been eating fruit and vegetables every day for 7 days, I want to eat something other than that for this one dessert, then kind of what I just said applies. But absolutely, yeah. So actually, I guess for me, and maybe this will tell you something about me as well. I mean, I like just an apple and some peanut butter. That's pretty good for me. You can even add some cocoa powder to the peanut butter, and that can taste pretty much like a dessert. So, you know, it's not going to be a top chef cake, but I don't know how to make a top chef cake, and so that's what I usually do.
Okay. There are several questions about holidays. So what you talked a little bit about kind of bringing your own food or prepping your own, but what if you're cooking for someone that is not plant-based?
So yeah, so this is where it comes a little more into play, the kind of those, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, those almost transition foods. I think if you're having somebody over who, you know, you want to continue to be plant-based, but you know, you don't really want to force that person to eat the way that you're eating, or you don't want to pressure them in any sort of way. I think that's a good middle ground, and you can almost even disguise it as a, hey, look what I'm making. Have you tried this before? You really should give it a try. You know, oftentimes you can even incorporate other plant-based foods with that. And so it's a good opportunity to you know, cook potatoes or to add beans or other things in there that can really become a part of a full meal anyway that is plant-based. But there's an opportunity there. You know, I most of my friends, if I'm cooking for somebody, they know what I eat. And so I've kind of set that expectation ahead of time too. I think that can be really helpful if you know, if you're used to going out to dinner and having a burger with a friend for the last 15 years, and then they come over and you say, surprise, here's a salad. It's probably not going to go over quite as well either. So I think it's worth talking to somebody and knowing what they like if you're trying to plan for somebody else. But I do want to piggyback off of this too, just to highlight something I said earlier about, you know, if you're going somewhere else where somebody else is cooking, or you know, these similar kind of foods can also be a good idea to take with you. And there's ways to prep stuff like that ahead of time too, so you're not quite as tempting when somebody else is cooking for you.
Awesome. So you don't recommend a tofu turkey surprising your family on
I'll be,
Thanksgiving?
I'll be honest, a tofu turkey or a tofurkey is pretty disgusting in my book. No offense to anybody who likes it. Again, everybody has their own tastes. I would not eat that even if somebody else made it for me. So yeah, no, I guess my answer is no to that. Yeah.
So we have someone who's been plant-based for years, but they've actually steadily gained weight on it. Do you have tips for them to address?
Yeah, so this kind of actually gets back to a little bit of what I was saying earlier about even like talking to your doctor about what you're, you know, are there other reasons you could be gaining weight that could be independent of a plant-based diet? Some of it, though I didn't really hone in on it as much this time around. If you're consuming in excess of the number of calories you would normally need to maintain your weight every day, even though you're healthier on a plant-based diet, it is going to make weight loss harder, or it can lead to weight gain as well. So it really is person specific. Yeah, I'd have you talk to your doctor just about why you might be gaining weight. What is it about a plant-based diet, if anything about the plant-based diet is contributing to it, and just try to tease that out a little bit.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of questions about drinks. So white wine, coffee, different teas. What is allowed in the plant-based diet, and what maybe are your favorites?
Yeah, so basically, you know, if it doesn't include dairy, it's probably going to be plant-based, quote unquote. Much like we talked about the Oreos and some of these other things, to my knowledge, something I'm pretty sure like Monster Energy, for instance, is probably plant-based. I don't consume that, so maybe somebody else can correct me after the fact here. But coffee is okay on a diet like that. If you're using a creamer, they make oat milk creamers and other alternatives that, again, I would actually argue I like better than dairy anyway. It turns out water. Everybody forgets that water is a thing you can consume. Turns out that's pretty healthy too. Would highly recommend it. Sweet teas and things like that, though, not particularly good for you, are technically plant-based. So it's really not much of a difference to be made there. It's just if you're consuming milk every day, maybe substitute that for a non-dairy alternative.
Yeah, definitely. And have you ever or been able to make a lemonade or something along those lines? Or like an orange juice?
Yeah. Well, so again, that's going to be plant-based, or even just if you're not somebody who likes drinking water in particular, or used to drinking things that aren't water and it just doesn't appeal to you, adding lemon or even like an orange slice to a glass of water can be pretty tasty in and of itself. So yeah, I think that'd be a good thing to try too.
Okay, awesome. And I'm going to go back to that transition period. So would you recommend doing like a grass-fed actual meat versus some of the substitute meats, or do you think it's better to really just stop meat altogether and move over?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I can't say that I've actually been asked that all that often, so I'll try to come up with my best response on the fly here. Ultimately, whether something's grass-fed or not, if you're consuming meat, it's still made up of the same components. Even before I started a plant-based diet, I'd never really been sold on the idea that grass-fed beef, outside of the lack of potential antibiotics and other things that are introduced, if that's also a part of it. I really am not sure that that's a healthier thing anyway. It's just a nice thing to slap on a label to make people feel good. Yeah, I would say steering clear of the meat entirely. It's still the same constituent saturated fats and the high cholesterol that contribute to things like heart attack and stroke and elevated cholesterol on your blood tests. Yeah, I would just steer clear of it entirely for those reasons.
Awesome. Okay. And then we have someone who loves Greek yogurt and is finding it hard to give up. What are your favorite plant-based yogurts?
Oh boy, I'm trying to remember the name. So Kite Hill can be a really good brand if you've not tried it. It's becoming more and more popular. I believe they also now have a non-dairy Greek yogurt in particular, actually, that they make. My wife and I like that quite a bit. There was another brand, you'll have to forgive me, that I can't remember. I used to eat quite a bit as well, but Kite Hill is the one that first comes to mind if you're looking for something. A lot of health food stores and even a lot of local stores like Meijer and places, I think, may carry stuff like that. So,
okay, maybe we can include Dr. Korycinski's favorite brands and some of your favorite plant-based treats eating, so that people can use them to get started.
Yeah, I had a thought to take a picture of the various cookbooks and things my wife and I use. We even have a cookbook for kids that's plant-based as well.
Awesome.
You can do quick Google searches of things like that too, and generally find some good ideas. There's a lot of websites available for things like that. Actually, the Forks Over Knives website has some stuff listed as well that I like, but yeah, maybe I'll have to put together my own meal plan at some point in time.
Yeah. We need your family favorites.
Yeah, we need the Korycinski family meal plan.
Exactly.
I'll get working on it. Yeah.
Excellent. So you were right. I think that this is a great time to transition to a plant-based diet because there are so many options out there. So someone's asking about pasta, but in my experience, I've seen pasta made of many different things, and a lot of them are plant-based.
Yeah, so yeah, it's true that egg in particular can be incorporated into various pastas, but there are a lot of them that are without egg, or some of them will even just they'll be labeled as dairy free to imply that they don't have anything that somebody who's not plant-based wouldn't want to consume. Actually, lentil and chickpea pasta I really enjoy, outside of the nutritional yeast. That's my kids love those pastas. My daughter Kira, the oldest one still in this picture here, would eat that every day if I gave it to her. And she actually sometimes will just eat pasta with nutritional yeast on it because it tastes like pasta with cheese sometimes, if it's cooked the right way. So yeah, there's a lot of plant-based pastas. For the person who asked about protein earlier too, those types of pastas can be a very good source of protein because lentils and chickpeas and those things are also very good sources of protein. So it's even just another added element there.
Awesome.
Mhm.
And do you have any thoughts on raw vegan or alkaline diets?
Yes, I guess I'll say this about them. Ultimately, I think they're healthy diets because generally you're eating things that aren't processed. You're eating them in their whole forms. But I won't pretend that I've delved deep enough into the research to know whether that's somehow superior to, a plant-based diet that isn't entirely raw. There's some evidence to suggest that if you're eating blueberries and strawberries as opposed to blending them up in a smoothie, that there's less breakdown of some of the nutrients and things that are associated with that. But yeah, that's sort of the extent of my knowledge on that specific diet. So I'm not going to pretend to know something I don't.
Okay, fair enough. So we have several people here who are asking, are you taking new patients? Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like if you're someone who's going through maybe some weight loss? Is that, I assume they'll be seeing more than maybe an annual physical. What does that look like in terms of the relationship between you and a patient who's going through that?
Yeah. So I sometimes joke with my patients that I'll see them every day if they really want to come see me that often. I have yet to have somebody take me up on that. Probably for very good reasons, but I see some folks as often as once a week getting the process started. That admittedly is pretty tedious for most folks. I'll sometimes see them every other week or every month or every 2 months, even if all we do is meet to review their diet and come up with ways that they can avoid some of the pitfalls that maybe they've fallen into in the past or things that have derailed them before. Generally, most of them will choose to check their weight at those visits as well because they want to trend where they go. But even then, you can tell a medical assistant or anybody who's rooming you that you don't want to know what your weight is, and it's not even something that we have to talk about. But in terms of the timeline, it quite literally could be every day I'm in the office if you want to come see me, or once a week or every other week or as often as you feel like you need. I see that kind of as my purpose to be there for when you need me. So
awesome. That's great. And someone was asking about the Rochester lifestyle medicine quick start program, or jump start, I think it's called. Excuse me. I do believe we've linked to that in the past. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, so there's a select number of doctors through our IHA health system that are certified in something called lifestyle medicine, which in addition to an emphasis on a plant-based diet generally incorporates other elements of health like social wellness, avoidance of alcohol and smoking, exercise, the mental health benefits that are associated with good lifestyle changes, and other things as well. But yeah, so that it's, to my knowledge, it's not one specific group in one location so much as it is there are a few doctors who are certified or board certified in lifestyle medicine who can help you through part of this process. And that focus on plant-based food is a big part of what they do. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, we have someone who's allergic to soy. I know we're kind of going back to protein.
That's okay.
What are some of the other good sources for protein?
Yeah, so I think I touched base on a couple of them. So actually, my favorite source for protein on a plant-based diet is actually like lentils and quinoa. Quinoa is actually a complete protein, so it includes all the different amino acids that make up the various proteins you consume. Kind of like meat is a complete protein, so is quinoa. Lentils, quinoa, beans are a really, really good source of protein. Some plant-based milks, like the pea milk, the pea protein milk that I mentioned earlier, can be a good source, and none of those involve soy in any way. So yeah, you don't have to consume soy to get enough protein on a plant-based diet, though it is an option if it's something available to you. But if you have an allergy to it, it's easy to avoid. You just gotta know what to look for.
Okay, awesome. And there are a lot of questions about you, so we'll wrap up with some of those. So where are you located? So you are at East Brighton Primary Care. And I will share all of the contact information and location with you in the follow-up email. And also you do virtual visits, I imagine.
Yeah. So I at least have 1 or 2 spots every day that I'm in the office that I set aside for virtual visits. So yeah, I can make those work too. Okay,
so if East Brighton is a drive for you, there are some other options of how to see you alternatively.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and then Okay, I'm just trying to look here. People are still adding
Yeah.
questions in. So,
Take your time and keep them coming. I'm actually
yeah.
really I'm happy people are taking an interest. This is
Oh,
getting me
for sure.
excited. So
Yes, you have almost 100 questions in here. If you can.
okay. We'll try to get as many as we can, right?
I'm trying to group them together in themes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone is asking about beer. Is there like a plant-based beer that?
Yeah, so unless you're in the habit of adding milk to your beer, it generally is plant-based. Again, I think there are different things to be said about how not everything that's plant-based is generally going to be healthy. But yeah, to my knowledge, outside of maybe we're getting again into the weeds here, the milk stouts and things like that, various types of beers are not going to be plant-based because there's obviously milk associated with them. But unless you're adding eggs or milk to your beer on your own, which I would recommend anyway, they're going to be plant-based. So
Okay, so plant-based versus whole foods is kind of what we're talking about here.
At that point, yeah. And when it comes to beer, still everything in moderation. It can be a part of a well-balanced diet if it's something that you enjoy, but absolutely should not be the backbone or a staple of that diet.
Okay. And someone's asking what type of physician you are. So you are a family medicine physician, and that means that you could see people of all ages, and you could see, like, for example, everyone in the photo that we're looking at, correct?
Yeah, I think my youngest patient as of today is probably about 3 or 4 weeks old, and I think my oldest is probably over 100. So
wow. So
yeah.
Really you see the whole family.
That's yeah, it's in the name. That's the
Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
So someone's asking a question: is a dried bean better than a canned bean?
Yes, in some ways. It's less to do with the bean itself and more the fact that oftentimes in like a can of beans, there's going to be a lot of salt in the liquid that it's used to be preserved in. And so if you're somebody who has, really high blood pressure, you're not going to want to pour out that can of beans right into a plate of food. You might want to wash it beforehand. Or if there are dry beans that you cook for yourself, that's great too. There really isn't, to my knowledge anyway, maybe there isn't, I'm just not in the know, a significant health benefit otherwise, but that is something I would be mindful of.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we'll wrap up with one last question. So they're looking for an answer on why seafood or fish isn't allowed, because I know in traditional diets, a lot of times it's kind of the healthy alternative.
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons for that. So while I would probably agree if somebody said, should I be consuming, or I already do consume fish instead of meat or some of these other things because it's generally fairly low in fat. It's a reasonable protein source. It's partly why I included the Mediterranean diet as a part of those that I listed, because there are some health benefits associated with a plant-based diet that does incorporate something like fish on occasion. There's a different conversation and sometimes stems even into a more sort of political and ethical argument about the consumption of fish, and also the kind of mercury and other compounds that are often associated with overconsumption of fish that in and of itself can be a health consequence. If you were to tell me that you eat a 99% plant-based diet, but you like to consume fish on occasion, I'm not going to drive to your house and slap the fish off your plate, right? I think, again, everything kind of in moderation there. And that was alluding a bit to the flexitarian kind of diet that I described earlier. You're still being healthy overall for practicing a plant-based diet. I would just encourage you to try to limit some of those things, even if only for the mercury and everything associated with it that can sometimes come from fish consumption. So I hopefully didn't get too convoluted in answering that.
No, I think it made sense. A couple more questions did come in. Do you want to hang for another minute or two?
Yeah, okay? Honestly, I would stay here all night. I don't want to take up too much of anybody else's time. So
you are passionate about plant-based eating. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. It turns out I gave this presentation for a reason. So
good.
Yeah.
So how about, okay, so we talked about fast food that's not good for you. Is there anything out there that can be an alternative, like especially if you're transitioning and you're not used to cooking for yourself, or you maybe don't have a lot of time? Like, can we do Mr. Pita, for instance, or anything out there?
Yeah, so there are actually guides out there that you can find with a quick Google search about how to, not again that this is necessarily a healthy practice, but how to go to like Taco Bell, for instance, on a plant-based diet, because there are people who are in that boat who have a hard time making that transition, or that's just where they get their food from. I think there's a larger conversation to be had about how to transition you away from that and get you into a place where you are used to cooking for yourself. Some of that is just experimenting with different things and probably failing a couple of times, just like with everything you might try to learn and gain a skill at the first time. But there are things like that out there. I am a particular fan of things like falafel and Mediterranean food, and that tends to be a go-to for me. I have the luxury of living not too far from a place like Ann Arbor that tends to have a lot of good resources. And much like there's plant-based aisles in stores now, there are also a lot of mom and pop kind of vegan places or plant-based places. Again, it may take some effort to look into it, but they can be good options if you're not used to cooking for yourself. And they're also in those plant-based aisles in stores too. There's sometimes pre-made meals and things you can look for, even if that just gives you an idea about something you might be able to make for yourself at some point.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And I do believe there are some apps available too that can kind of help you out with that. And then especially like if you're going on vacation and you're not familiar with the restaurants, and that can be
Yeah.
kind of a challenge.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, that's probably one of the more difficult aspects of really any diet, let alone a plant-based diet. If you're on a keto diet and you go somewhere where they're making, a pie for Thanksgiving dessert, you're going to run into some issues there too, right? So it's not unique to a plant-based diet. I really do think it just takes a little bit more effort in planning ahead of time where you might go on a vacation if you're going to eat somewhere, or just understanding what kinds of places tend to have the food available that you're looking for. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a little bit more tedious than your life otherwise might have been, but if we're talking about trying to lose weight and be healthier overall, I think the effort is worth it.
Awesome. So with that, I think we've covered most of the themes here in the questions.
Okay.
So just a reminder to everyone who's hanging on the call, we will share a recording of this and you will receive that in the next few days via email. So whichever email you use to register for this class or for this presentation is where you'll receive the follow-up. So thank you so much, Dr. Korycinski. This was super inspiring and it was a great presentation, and we appreciate you hanging for an extra 15-20 minutes here to answer all these questions.
Yeah, no problem. It's my pleasure. I really enjoy talking about it. I do what I do because I want to help people, and I don't think there's a better way that I can help people than introducing them to something like this. And so yeah, no, I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. And again, I will have your contact information in the follow-up email as well. So look for that to come in the next few days. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Korycinski.
Yeah, you're welcome. Everybody take care. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.